Welcome to Meeting of the Minds, the interview discussion show that explores topics in the atheism, theism landscape in a civil and respectful manner. My name is Christopher Mowdy, I'm your host, and I'm pleased to have with me for my first show today, John Dewey, a theist. We're going to discuss free will and determinism as it pertains to the theist and atheist worldviews. But before we do, I have a couple of announcements. First, if you're interested in getting in on the discussion of Meeting of the Minds, there is a Facebook page. So before you do anything, stop what you're doing. Go to Facebook, find Meeting of the Minds, search for it, join us, engage in the conversation, shadoos it. Secondly, after you do that, go to YouTube, look up Mowdy Man, Mauteman, and there is a channel. Subscribe. I will be sending out promos for each of my guests. I will also be uploading post-show wrap-ups, and I will also be mirroring the episodes when they are uploaded onto the New Covenant Group's channel. And you can look up Cayenne Diatheke. If I'm pronouncing that correctly, that is the New Covenant Group's YouTube channel, so I recommend that you look that up as well. Good luck spelling it. Also, I wanted to say that this is the first of two shows today, and this is the last weekend where I will be doing two shows. This is the 2 o'clock Central show, and I will also be doing a 4 o'clock Central show where my guest will be Eric, a self-proclaimed atheist Satanist. And so he and I are going to have a nice conversation about exactly what it is that he believes and why. So please join me in a couple hours for that conversation. Now, housekeeping is done. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing well.
Are you there, John? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry about that. So, you doing all right today?
Yeah, I'm doing great.
Excellent. So, for those of you that are unaware, I know John from a Facebook group that's called Creationism, and he was recommended to me by one of the admins on that page because he came highly recommended. And a little while ago, John posted something on the Facebook page that had to do with free will and determinism, and he's very well versed in it. And we're going to get into that discussion in a little bit. But in order to take his temperature on the basic questions that I always like to ask everybody, I'm going to ask him those introductory questions. So here we go. So John, first I'd like you to take a little bit of time and tell us how you would identify or label yourself.
I would label myself as a Christian. I wouldn't go for any particular denomination. I've grown up in a number of different ones, but just as a normative label, a Christian theist.
A Christian theist. Okay, and how would you describe that worldview?
So I guess the worldview is a worldview that believes that God is active in the world. He does miracles today, he did miracles in the past, and one that believes very much in sort of rationalism and science, and that in the normal course of things, we can do something, we can repeat it, and we can expect the world to be reliable and produce the same sort of results. We don't have random stuff just happening for no reason.
Okay. You're breaking up a little bit. I just wanted to know, can you hear me well?
I can hear you great.
Okay.
Maybe if I lean a little bit forward, this will...
No, I think it's just the resolution.
Is this better?
It might have to do with where I'm located in my house. But, I'm going to make do with what I can hear. So, you mentioned, and once again, I'm not going to bust your chops right now, but a little later I might bust your chops. You mentioned that your worldview relies on humans being rational?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to bust your chops a little bit on that a little bit later because I have a twist on that particular theme, but I'm not going to bust your chops right now. What I would like to do, and by busting chops, I'm going to do it very gently and not going to do it in a challenging way, or I'm going to do it in a challenging way, but in a respectfully challenging way. I'd like you to give me a description of your interpretation of the Bible, and I'm going to break it down according to this dichotomy. Would you say that you have an orthodox interpretation of the Bible, and by that I mean it is the revealed Word of God directly, or a non-orthodox interpretation of the Bible, and by that I mean you allow for the interpretation of man in your perception of the Bible?
In general, I would say I come on the Orthodox side. I believe that the Bible is God's Word. I would probably go, if I was self-labeling, for divinely inspired. So I don't think that God sat there and dictated every word of the Bible, and that the human authors who wrote the Bible said, wait, can you repeat that word? And were scribbling word for word exactly what God told them.
Okay. And so the next question is, from your perspective, how old is the Earth?
So interestingly enough, I don't have an opinion on the age of the Earth or the age of the universe. It's an interesting question. I think Christianity has room in it for a number of answers. And that's one of the reasons that I sort of frequent on the Creationist Forum, is I'm just kind of interested in hearing the arguments. I see good arguments for a number of different opinions on that.
Okay. That's a very honest answer, and I appreciate that. And I have a feeling that that's going to also roll over into my next question, which is, what is your opinion of the theory of evolution?
So, the theory of evolution, I think that we have well established that life forms can change. And I think that we can well establish some variety of change. When talking about the theory of evolution, there's typically a number of things that get kind of rolled into that. So one is that things are changing. One is a theory of origins, or common descent, and another is, how did it all get started? I'm not really convinced on the arguments for common descent, especially a single common descent. I think the most persuasive evidence for that, I think the most persuasive evidence in favor of it is some of the genetic markers where they're talking about, well, this is most likely a disease that happened back then, and you have two of these species, and you have the same defect in the ability to process some vitamin or something like that. And I think that is some strong evidence for that. Okay. On the flip side, I think you have a fair amount of evidence against common descent in the great specialization required and kind of the time divergence and a number of very complicated changes that are required to happen all at once.
Okay. So what led you to your current beliefs?
In
general.
Evolution, or like what particularly?
Your worldview, your general worldview.
I think it's an amalgamation of everything I've learned and experienced over life. Worldviews are always changing. So as I get older, I've had, my worldview is not the same as it's always been. Okay. And in, say, another 10 years, I would expect it to be different. Okay. And I'm probably doing something wrong if it is the same in another 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Good point. And in this development, let's call it, let's just put a label on what you just said. You're developing, right? As a human being, you're developing. Your opinion 10 years ago is not the opinion you have now, is not the opinion you will have 10 years from now. It's developing, right?
Right.
So in that development in the past, the backwards trajectory of your development, have you ever been something that you would call or label an atheist?
No, I don't think I would.
Okay.
I've always had a fairly strong belief in God. That's not to say I haven't questioned and sort of had times where I was wondering what was going on, and I was actively seeking out more information and sort of experimenting. But I wouldn't really say that I ever really gave up that belief.
Okay. So even though you questioned, it never got to the point where your questioning leaned towards atheism or even agnosticism?
No, I don't think it would.
Okay, cool. So those are the introductory questions. You made it out alive, bro. So now we get into the meat of the conversation, which is about free will and determinism. So as I mentioned earlier, you posted something on a forum asking a very pointed question about people's position on determinism. Could you please tell the audience what that question was, and could you please define the terms that you used?
Sure. So I posted kind of an online poll on the Creationist forum. And there were two components to this poll. One was, are you a theist or are you an atheist? And I think those positions are fairly well explained. And then the other was a kind of a three-pointed discussion of stances on free will. So one would be a libertine free will position, which is essentially I have a will that is actively doing what I want. I move my arm up because I want to, and there isn't something that's causing me to want to. I could choose to move it down. I could choose to move it up. It doesn't matter. That's up to me. On the flip side would be kind of a mechanistic determinist view, which says everything is determined from the beginning. So whenever time started, there was a bunch of molecules in motion. Inherent in the view, it's kind of we live in a mechanistic world, so each cause caused another effect, which caused another effect. And so if we knew enough about the world, we could predict what would happen later. And a person in that view would not have free will. They would be more akin to robots. I'm talking right now not because I chose to. I couldn't have chosen otherwise because of the conditions.
Would you say that those are like two anchors on a continuum?
Well, my view, yeah. Well, it depends who you ask. So in my view, it's not a continuum. In my view, you can't. The middle ground is not really a valid position. But a lot of people, but people who would label themselves in the middle ground, who would label themselves a compatibilist, would say no. You can actually take those two positions and you can say they're compatible, and there's a way that works, and it's not contradictory. So the middle view would say that, yes, all of our actions were determined from the beginning, but we still have free will. And kind of and because it's mostly defined as a compatibilist view, the explanation that's given for why varies among different people. And I think you see some different posts on the poll that I did where people gave slightly different explanations for how they saw and interpreted their compatibilist view.
Okay. And
A
so
lot
those
of
are the three positions?
three positions.
Okay, so can I paraphrase them just to make sure that I have my head wrapped around them?
Sure.
Okay, so you have the mechanistic determinists, which say life choices are determined. There is no free will. Then there is the libertine free will proponents, which say no, all the choices I make are I engage in total freedom, in that my choices are my choices. And then there's the compatibilists that say that, well, even though some things are determined, that doesn't prevent me from engaging in freedom.
I would nuance the compatibilist because I might actually agree with your summary of the compatibilist in a libertine view. So I think the compatibilist is not saying that some things are deterministic and some things are free will. The compatibilist is saying that it can be determined and free will at the same time.
Okay. All right. I think that makes sense. The compatibilist thing is still a little fuzzy to me, but for the sake of discussion, let's accept that definition, or let's accept the fact that it's fuzzy for me. Okay. Now, where do you fall in those three categories?
I fall on the libertine free will side.
Okay. And as a theist, how does that work out?
So as a theist, it works out in that God created people with an ability to choose, with free will. So he didn't create a bunch of robots. He didn't create a universe and in the universe create a bunch of robots and just sort of watch his created thing unfold. He created people that have real choices that make real consequences within the world. And as a consequence, it has a implication for kind of the classical three O's when you're talking about omnipotence and when you're talking about what God can do. God is limiting his power to override your free will. He's not creating creatures and then pretending they have free will, but causing them to act in certain ways. So God is not forcing me to talk right now, nor is he forcing you to talk right now. That would be part of the free will. We're both choosing to do this.
Okay. Now, that addresses his omnipotence, but how about his omniscience? I mean, just because the first thing that comes to my mind is if God knows everything, then he knows what's going to happen. And if he knows what's going to happen, then it must already be predetermined.
Right. So, interestingly enough, there would be different people would disagree on different points. So there are open theists who would say, well, who would agree with those definitions and say, and because of that, God can't actually know the future because the future is unknowable. So God knows everything that's knowable and the future is unknowable. I wouldn't classify myself as an open theist.
Okay.
I hold to the theory of divine middle knowledge. There's a number of names for it. I think middle knowledge is the most, I don't know, probably I'm not sure if it's the most common, but it's fairly unique, and so it's a searchable, Googleable term. But essentially it says that before God created the universe, he looked at the universes he could create, and he chose one among the possibilities. And it defines a difference between what will happen and what could happen. Mm-hmm. There's only one future. So 10 minutes from now, something will happen. Mm-hmm. And assuming I'm still alive, I will make a choice 10 minutes from now, and I'm going to do something, I'm going to say something. And that future is not open in the sense that it's going it's going to change or it can change. I have real choices, but that future is what it's going to be. I could make a choice such that that future will be different. But there's only one choice I'm going to make, and there's only one future that's going to happen. And God knows the futures that's going to happen. He knows the choices I'm going to make, but he doesn't force me to make those choices. So I think it's possible that a creature or God can know the future without being the cause of that future.
I like that explanation. It makes it sound like God is engaging in a buyer beware, caveat emptor before he created the universe. It's like, well, I could choose this universe or this universe, but I like this one the best. So that's an interesting explanation. Now, in the secular philosophical community, the question of determinism kind of spins out into like physics and quantum particles and things that I'm honestly just not qualified to speak about. So I'd like to bounce an idea off of you just to see what you think about it. And I'm going to try to frame this in an area that I am familiar with, which is the cognitive and behavioral sciences. And I'm going to try to put it in terms that we can both talk about so that I'm not like talking about something that I'm super familiar with at the risk of talking about something that nobody else understands. So,
Sure.
So let's see how it goes. I'm reluctant to say that behavior is determined. In as much as our choices are constrained. And this limits our freedom of our will in the free will debate. So specifically, let's see if I can I wrote this out so that I could articulate it as best as possible here. So specifically, our choices are constrained by things like cognitive biases. And these cognitive biases we use to cull our options to choose from. And then we have heuristics, which are mental shortcuts, which we use to make our choices. And also throw in the individual differences of our experiences, which affect our expectations, and our memories, which also affect our expectations, which are based on our experiences. And you have a pastiche of trajectories that can determine who chooses what. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this little pet theory I have, which is much more psychologically based as a way of saying that even though our cognitive biases and our heuristics constrain the choices that we can make, it doesn't necessarily determine the choices we're going to make. But it certainly constrains, depending on the person, what choices are available to them because it limits the options that are available to choose from.
I think it influences our abilities. So I wouldn't go as far as to agree that it's a hard constraint on our choices that we make. I think especially in the arts or with a scientific breakthrough or when someone has an epiphany, they're typically departing from what they've been trained and their history and a number of these sort of cognitive biases that they have, and they're coming up with an idea and a thought and something that works that's truly their own. And I think that there is certainly something to be said for momentum in choices and people. And, you know, from a psychological viewpoint, I think there's a lot of truth in what you said. People make choices, and, you know, I pick a career path. I start taking some college or taking some courses in college. I like it, and I kind of stop considering the other choices. Not because I've done an exhaustive search of the other choices, but because of some heuristics, and it's just easier, and that's the choices that are going to make. And so most of the thinking is going to be within the bounds of that particular thought. And so then you have a major and you have some choices within that major. But I'm not thinking, when someone's doing that, they aren't thinking, oh my gosh, I majored in computer science. Maybe I should go drive oil tankers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, that's actually a really, really good example. The one that I use sometimes is watching the news. Sometimes when you watch the news and like I live in a major city, I live in Philadelphia, so you see a lot of different. You see a range of news stories when you live in a major city. And sometimes you'll see somebody do something where you're like, why didn't they just fill in the blank? And it's moments like that that make me acutely aware of the fact that that person couldn't have made the choice that I'm thinking they should have made, because the options that were available to them were culled based on their life, their experience, and therefore their expectations and the options that were available to them. So they really didn't have the free will to sit back and think about all of the real options that were available to them. They were only thinking about the options that cornered them into the position that they were in, and they happened to make what looked like to us a bad decision.
Yeah. So, and in that sense of free will, I would agree our free will is limited, or they didn't have complete free will. But in the sense of free will that I think that I like to think about for the free will versus determinism, it's not that I have a free will of making a perfect choice and I could press pause on my life like I press pause on a video game and sit there and think, what is my best options? It's a free will to make choices, but there are constraints on the choices. You're making the choices in real time.
Yes.
If I had infinite time to think about choices, I would make hopefully far better choices.
That's a good point. But ultimately, and this is where I want to bust your chops about the rationality. My belief is, and I'm having an argument with one of my atheist friends on Facebook about this on the Meaning of the Minds page on Facebook. Don't forget to go look that up. About the fact that humans are, in general, irrational. So even if you had an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of options, you could think infinitely about your options until you put preference into the decision cycle, and preference is an affect is an emotion. So decisions are really made not on reason, not on rationality, but on emotions. And emotions are not rational.
That's an interesting thought.
And I didn't make that up. That's the premise of Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error. And the reason why it's called Descartes' Error is because Descartes is popular for the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. And he's like, not so much. You can think all you want, but it's your emotions that really break the chain of thinking. You can think and think and think and think and think, but that thinking is perpetual until you interject an emotion via affect, via preference, to stop that cycle of thinking. That's when decisions are made.
Well, so I wouldn't quite. I'm not familiar with what you're talking with the book and reference you're making. I suspect that it's an older reference and that emotion is being used in a slightly different term than we would use emotion today. So if I were to think, if I were to use the sort of vocabulary that I would use to describe the human mind, I would say that we have a rational side that sort of thinks through things logically, and that is a distinctive characteristic of humans, that we have the capability to do that. And we have an emotional side that gives us emotional input, but the locus of free will is kind of the side that decides, the side that has a will, the side that has a motivation. And that side can choose to ignore emotion, like when we're brave and we ignore the emotion of fear and we persevere through that. And it can choose to completely go with the flow and love the emotion, and like two romantic partners when they're just intimately involved with each other and they aren't really necessarily thinking, they're just kind of going with the emotion and letting those motivations rule and enjoying that. But I don't think emotion is necessarily what kicks us off to a decision, and I don't think that, or at least in my view, reason is not what makes our decision, and it's not what makes free will. We could have free will and be utterly incapable of reasoning.
Good point.
We just would act like a crazy person.
And fortunately, we don't. Or at least we don't. You and I don't. I can't speak for people like Joey Livingston, but be that as it may. And by the way, Joey's the producer that we talked to right before the show. So I need to wrap up this discussion part of the show, and I really appreciate your honesty and your willingness to listen to my pet theories. And I'd like to start asking you some of the closing questions now, and use up the last 10 minutes of the show for that. And as I mentioned to you before the show, these are more like lightning round questions where you're more than welcome to go into detail with your answers, but if you want it to be pithy, I would be cool with that as well. So I'm going to start with kind of a bit of a challenging question, which is, would the world be better off without atheists?
No.
Okay. Do you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, so if the world was without atheists, the world would be without free will. I don't think the world could be like it is with the setup it is without some people being atheists.
Excellent. I like that. And another question for you would be, what evidence would disprove your worldview, your theistic worldview?
So evidence that would disprove my Christianity would be showing that Jesus didn't die or Jesus didn't exist. Evidence that would disprove my theistic views, I think, would have to come in the form of philosophical arguments, that some proof that God cannot exist. And I think if I became convinced that the arguments of that an omnipotent, powerful, and loving God could not exist, I think that would convince me to discard my belief in a monotheistic worldview, and I would have to try and figure out what I'd believe after that.
Okay. And a next question would be, what question do you most want to be, would you most want to be asked by an atheist?
I think the question I'd most want to be asked by an atheist is the question that is at the heart of why they're an atheist. So asking me to explain what they think is unexplainable for the reason why they're an atheist, or those sorts of questions that kind of cut to the heart of why they're an atheist. And those are the questions I'd most like to be asked, because that's what I'm interested in talking about with people, is what they really deeply care about and the arguments they find really persuasive.
And if you don't mind, like, what would the answer to a question like that be? Or would that be like a full-blown discussion?
I think it would probably be a full-blown discussion, and it probably wouldn't be a discussion that ended in a day.
Gotcha.
I think the most interesting discussions I've had with people have been over time, where we kind of go back and forth with, well, what about this? And, well, I don't know about that, but what about this? And sort of just going back and forth and having interesting conversations.
Okay. And what question would you least want to be asked by an atheist?
Why are you sending me to hell? Or why do you have to be like this other Christian? Or things that assume beliefs that I don't necessarily have.
Gotcha.
Or
straw
things
man
that are
arguments.
dismissive, that don't really care for an answer.
Okay. So here's two questions that are similar to the questions I asked you, but a little bit more pointed. What is the best argument you've heard against your position?
The best argument I've heard against sort of free will or theism?
Theism.
Theism. I think it's the argument for evil. The amount of evil in the world, and it doesn't disprove theism necessarily, but it makes you wonder whether God is really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I can interject, I just think that your articulation of your position on determinism and free will really explains the problem of evil really well in your framework. I mean, I don't know, like the position of evil makes sense to me based on the way that you articulated your position of God's position on free will. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, yes. And that's a large component of the problem of evil.
Okay.
But if I were to be more specific about the problem of evil, it would be the problem of gratuitous suffering. And the fact that gratuitous suffering at least appears to exist in the world. And if I were to say that God was loving, I would say, well, why doesn't he cut some of that suffering short?
Okay, I see.
And I have theological arguments, and I've listened to people, and they kind of make sense, but they aren't really satisfying to me as an answer.
Oh, okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So the flip side of that coin is, what are some of the worst arguments that you've heard against your position?
I think it's the emotional arguments. Like I can't believe in God because I want to have sex.
People really say that?
I have been told that.
Yeah, that's a really bad argument. I think that's the best answer to that question that I've heard so far. All right, that's a great answer. All right, so this next one is going to be the final question. So if you could pick somebody to represent your position to answer the question, does God exist? What field would they be from, and why?
At the moment, I think it would be philosophy.
Okay.
And the reason is because philosophy deals with the sort of the foundations of human knowledge, and what we can get and what we can explain from pure logic. And I think there is a very strong philosophical case for the existence of a God. It doesn't get you to Christianity, but I think there's a very strong argument that theism is true. And I think you have to go beyond philosophy and going to other fields to get to Christianity and other things. But I think for the theist question, philosophy can get you a long ways towards answering those questions. And my biggest objections come from philosophy as well. So I think in that sense, I'm very philosophically minded.
Great. So we actually have a couple minutes left. Do you mind telling me what some of your favorite philosophical arguments for pro-theism are?
So I think the argument that says everything has a beginning. You've probably seen people do variations of this on the Creationist Forum.
The cosmological argument?
Yeah, the cosmological argument that the universe had a beginning, time had a beginning, and the universe must have a cause. And even if you go to some sort of cyclical universe or a meta-universe explanation, our best things are those things must have had a cause. And it somewhat ties into free will in this relation, because when you go and you ask, okay, well, the universe had a cause, what was its cause? And you have to go, well, it can't be anything material because the universe contains all the material world. And it can't really be something that's temporal because the universe contains time and time started. And then you get to, well, what kind of causes could do this? And you get to something's will would do this. And it must be an immaterial and eternal necessary cause. So it's always happening. It didn't begin to happen. It's continually happening. And I think a soul or a will causing the universe is the only sort of cause that's really in the playing field, because all the other causes that we know about are physical.
Mm-hmm. So how does that tie into the free will? Pull it together for me.
So that pulls into the free will because you don't have a soul. If you have no free will, you can't have a soul. The concept of a soul is simply a manifestation of a particular physical state that supervenes upon the physical state. And we say it's a soul because it has these characteristics, but it isn't a real thing. It's just a description of a bunch of characteristics that happen to happen, like saying that water is wet. It's just saying another way of describing the physical and chemical properties of water. It isn't something that actually exists. And if you have a free will, there is something that is making that will. And you can be an atheist and say that we don't really know where this thing that is causing this will to come from. Maybe there's a will particle we haven't discovered, and that somehow attached itself to human beings. But you have to have, but without a free will, you have absolutely nothing that can cause the universe. We have no known causes at all. We've, in fact, eliminated every known cause that can cause anything that we know of.
Well, on that note, I'm going to end this show because that was a deep thought, my friend, and I really appreciate you taking time out of the day to talk to me. And the invitation is open for another session for a different topic. And for the people that are watching, I want to let you know that in a couple minutes, I'm going to record a post-show wrap-up, and I'm going to put that on my YouTube channel, which once again is user/Mauteman, MAUTEMAN, and I recommend that you go there and subscribe so that you can get promos and little ditties about the show. And John, thank you very, very much for spending time with me today.
Yeah, I think this was an enjoyable time. Thanks
Great.
for having a chat.
No doubt. And hopefully you'll do it with me again in the future. All
Yeah, it
right,
might be
everybody,
nice.
thank you very much for stopping by. And don't forget to check me out in another couple hours at 5 o'clock Central, 4 o'clock, 4 o'clock Central, 5 o'clock Eastern, when I have Eric, the atheist Satanist, on as my guest. I will see you then.